Hello, I'm Lindsay Sisk. Welcome to the Marriage Challenge podcast, brought to you by Care for the Family. In this episode, we're joined by Mike and Kath Coulson, who are going to talk about the difficult topic of when a child dies and how, as a couple, it's possible to maintain your relationship through grief and sorrow of losing a child. But first, let me introduce them. Mike and Kath have been married for 35 years. They have 4 children, 2 of whom have now left home, 1 is still at school, and their eldest son, Philip, sadly died of a brain hemorrhage aged 7. Together they coordinate the Bereaved Parent Support Project for Care for the Family. So Mike and Kath, thank you for joining us. It's great to have you with us.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
So the first thing we'd like to ask you is, how did you two meet and end up getting married?
Well, when I left home to train, I went over to Newcastle, which was Mike's hometown, and he just finished uni. So we met in the church that we were both part of there, but he was just about to jet off to the other side of the world. So we had a friendship to start with, which was really nice, and we used to communicate. He worked on a ship. We first started becoming close, so when he was home on leave, and it sort of went from there, really. We had a little bit of a false start, which we went out and then stopped, and then 6 months later, the relationship started, but we were away from each other for the large part of the time that we were going out, and it wasn't until 2.5 years later that we actually got married.
So now, looking at a topic that's so painful for those that experience it, and that's the death of a child, can you tell me a little bit about your story?
Yeah, Philip, well, we had 2 boys. Philip was 7, Ian was 3 3/4, and Philip took ill at school one day, and sadly he died about 8.5 hours later. It was totally unexpected. It was something called an arteriovenous malformation. It caused a brain hemorrhage. He was taken, first of all, we took him to A&E, and then he was taken to a neuroscience hospital. But they operated, but they were unable to save him. So our lives changed in the course of that one day, totally unexpectedly, totally suddenly. And we had to then become very different people, I think, from that point onwards.
So what effect did Philip's death have on your couple relationship?
I think this was just such a massive change. You know, there's a change when you get married, and that's exciting things that you look forward to. There's a change when you have a baby and a second child, and they're all changes and challenges, but there's something which you're planned for, you're prepared for, and you welcome into your life. But this was something out of the blue which changed our lives dramatically and forever. But we'd had no training, we'd had no classes for that, and in a way we felt as if there was nowhere to look for the support that we needed for something which had felt as if had blown our relationship apart, really.
When one of you loses a parent, it affects one of you perhaps in a very different way from the other. But when you lose a child, it affects you both, not quite equally, because you are both unique characters. But we were both in that place of having lost our oldest son, and that was incredibly hard. Some days we found ourselves up, some down, and I think it was more difficult to cope with each other on days when we both were down.
Well, wasn't one person could be the strong one. Mike's dad died, and I could rally around and help him and support him and love him and care for him, but we were both in that same place of devastation, really.
And we wanted to support each other, but there were times where we just weren't able, because one of the strange things is that emotions take physical energy. Your body is just trying to cope with all these hugely strong emotions, and that was really, really hard, and caused quite a few struggles and obviously difficulties within the relationship.
And what things did you find helped you during this time?
I think there had to be a variety of things. We needed people, the GP being one of those. We had a lady who we saw quite regularly who was a bereavement support worker. Occasionally on our own we would see her, but often together, and she was just there to listen, and it was great. It was like sort of emptying everything out that had gone on. So that person who gave you that time was lovely. And just friends being friends. They helped us practically, but also there was people who we knew would want to fight for our marriage as well, and I think that was really important. People who would understand where we were, but would be willing to challenge us as well if we were going a bit off track with each other. But we needed space as well. I think although we needed to invest in time together, we also needed time to be away from each other to process our own grief, and that made us stronger as we came back together. And so we needed individual people to talk to, friends to talk to, as well as investing in time together.
Yeah, that space apart was particularly helpful on days when we both were down and we just couldn't cope with each other. But I found that really uncomfortable because I felt like I was deserting my wife, but I needed to get out, I needed space on my own, and kind of, I suppose the introvert side of me needed to come out. And I needed to just walk and think and pray and sometimes shout. But then we could come back together and be better placed to support each other and care for each other, having got some of that emotion and that pent-up grief out.
It definitely was better to come back together and not take that out on each other, because there is a real danger that you've got that build-up of emotion that you can begin to sort of fire off at each other and take it out on each other if you were feeling sore and vulnerable, and that's sort of one of the dangers, I think. So it was important that we found safe places to do that and not take it out on each other.
Did you find it hard to communicate during this time?
We're both quite talkers, which is, Mike for a guy is quite a talker, and so that was quite good in that we were similar in that way and we wanted to talk. So when we were in that calm place, we did spend hours and hours talking and walking and getting that space together, and so communication when we were both level was okay, but we would have a tendency, if we were not good, that it could descend into anger, so we had to take care of that. Other side, the physical side of the relationship was quite hard at times, wasn't it?
Yes, it was. On the physical side of the relationship, that was difficult. And whereas a man tends to want physical comfort when he feels down, that was not the case for Kath, and she wasn't able to give that. So sex was off the agenda for months, really, wasn't it?
Well, I just think a woman needs to feel safe and comfortable and at ease, and I think we were in very different places for that. So that was a real challenge which we had to talk about, we had to communicate about, we had to learn to communicate about, we had to be very patient with each other and try and see things from the other person's perspective. So even though we might not understand the other person, we had to try to listen to them and hear their point of view.
I know that you support many other couples through the work that you do with bereaved parents. What are some of the common relationship challenges that couples face after the loss of a child?
So I think there can be different things, some of the things we've mentioned, but I think, as I said, some guys do not want to talk. They don't see the need to talk. They process things internally. So I think some guys, some women may do, need more time on their own and not be communicating verbally with their partner, whereas some women want to talk and talk. Some people want to have people around them. Some people want time alone. Some people want to find out lots of facts about what has happened and do investigations, whereas some people will shut down more and be disinterested in that.
Yeah, our natural characters, I think, are quite similar. But some couples are very, very different. And I think recognising your differences is really helpful. And sometimes couples need to recognise that their partner grieves very differently from them, but that's not wrong. And men sometimes would tend to grieve by doing things. They want to just take themselves off and go and do something. And we've certainly come across a number of guys who've wanted to make something or tidy something, or one guy who seemed to spend his time just carrying stones from one end of the garden to the other, because he just wanted to do something, and he wasn't achieving much, but he needed to do something. Whereas women sometimes have found it more difficult to understand that. We both cried buckets and buckets, but some couples we've come across, one person has cried, the other person hardly cries at all. There can be then sometimes a thought process creeping in that thinks, well, that person's not crying, therefore they're not really missing our son or daughter. But that's not true. They're just very different and grieving very differently.
And just learning to respect differences, I think, is really important because it can perhaps accentuate some of the differences. When you have a big trauma comes into your marriage, you perhaps see characteristics that you didn't know were there. So learning to respect somebody who you don't understand and learning to love them despite of not understanding them is really important, I think, for moving forward and continuing to grow in your marriage.
So do you find that there have been different challenges to your relationship over the years than those you faced in the early days of your grief?
Yes, I think essentially there's got to be. I think one of the things we recognised within minutes of Philip dying, that this was going to be something which impacted us as a couple and as a family for the rest of our lives. So it was something which was not in the plan. It wasn't in all of the things which we were looking to the future with, but it was going to have a huge impact going forwards. March is a particularly difficult time of year generally because that was his birthday was March and he died in March. So I think that is perhaps one of the times of year where we have to put particular strategies in place which help us. We've got used to him not being here day to day, but of course the long-term thing of missing him not being here, and perhaps March is one of the times when we do particular things to support ourselves about that.
But I think over the years as well, we've developed strategies which mean that we do think about Philip every day in some way. At certain times of the year, like Kath said, we plan ahead a bit, particularly on the anniversary of his death. We normally try and take the day off and just go off somewhere where we can be away from people and just on our own together and be able to talk together and just process our thoughts and our feelings.
It's not always sad, sometimes it's happy memories, but it's all part of who we are and who we are as a couple and a family.
And I wouldn't want anyone to think that we spend our lives moping and grieving. The loss is part of who we are, and we've learnt to just adopt that as the people we are now, and life has grown around that. And we have many, many happy times, but there are certain times that we need to set aside where we know we're more vulnerable and we need to protect ourselves a little bit on that. And March being one of those. We never know how it's going to be because it varies year to year. And sometimes we get through March and think, well, that wasn't too bad. And sometimes it was pretty awful. And we've just got to be gentle with each other.
Is there anything that you've put in place to keep your relationship strong over these challenging years?
I think our understanding of how we are and who we are has grown over the years as we've just existed in that relationship and found what we call a new normal. When Philip died, we knew that life would never be normal again as we knew it, but we have moved on over the years to find a new normal. And that impacts the family, but that impacts our relationship as a couple, I think. And so we're very different people, I think, from what we would have been if this hadn't happened.
And I think that's one of the things we have had to adjust to. We're not the people that we were when we married. And so whilst everybody grows and changes throughout their lives, we became different people having gone through this experience. It changed our characters, it changed our outlook on life. So we had to get used to the new me as to who I was, but I also had to get used to a new husband. He was not the same person, he changed. And so that took a lot of adapting and just patience and time, really. And I think that comes down to the openness and honesty of communication.
For any couples listening who are currently walking through the deep pain of losing a child, what advice would you give to them?
I think give each other time and space, but also make sure you've got other people around you.
Recognise your differences, keep the communication going, tell each other how you're feeling so you can understand each other better.
Mike and Kath, thank you so much for being so open in all that you've talked about. Now, before we finish, in every episode we ask the guest couple to give us a marriage challenge, something practical that listeners can try over the coming weeks. So considering all that we've talked about today, what challenge would you like to give our listeners on this topic?
One of the things I think we've discovered over the years is that loss is loss. And it may be the loss of a child or some other major trauma in your life. And I think one of the things that we'll find always in marriages is that storms will come along at some point. So who have you got around you who will fight for your marriage when storms hit your relationship? Who have you got? Do you need to find anyone?
Thanks for that. I think that's really helpful advice for those that are listening. And for anyone who's listening who has lost a son or daughter, do check out the Care for Family website and have a look at the bereavement support pages and find out more about our bereaved parent support resources. Well, that's all for this episode. It just leaves me to say thank you, Mike and Kath, for joining us, and we look forward to tackling another marriage challenge next time. Goodbye.
You have been listening to the Marriage Challenge podcast. For further information about our courses, resources and events, visit us at www.careforthefamily.org.uk.